The morning light came through the curtains the same way it always had, thin and pale, stretching across the kitchen floor like it wasn't sure it was welcome. I stood at the counter with my coffee and looked at the yard, the rose bushes I'd planted, the summer my husband passed, the wooden fence my son had promised 3 years ago he'd repaint. It was still gray and peeling. I'd stopped mentioning it. I was 63 years old, and I had learned that some things you just stop mentioning. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I was a mother, a retired nurse, a woman who had spent 40 years putting other people's needs before her own, and had told herself, for most of those years, that this was simply what love looked like. I had believed that. I want you to know I had truly believed it. My son was my whole world. I know every mother says that, and I know how it sounds, sentimental, a little desperate. But when your husband dies of a heart attack at 51, when you're left alone in a house that still smells like him, and your son is 17, and looking at you across the dinner table like he's trying to figure out whether you're going to fall apart, that boy becomes the thing you hold on to. He became the reason I kept the lights on. The reason I got up and put on my scrubs and drove to the hospital at 5 in the morning and smiled at patients who were frightened and in pain. I did it for him. I worked 31 years as a nurse. I saved. I was careful. When my son got into college out of state, I paid for it all 4 years because his father had left a small life insurance policy, and I had added to it every year like I was tending something fragile. I wanted him to start his life without debt. I wanted to give him that. It felt, at the time, like the most important thing I could do. He graduated and got a job in the city, and I was proud in a way that filled my whole chest. He called every week at first, then every other week. Then, when he had something to tell me, the something he had to tell me 2 years after graduation was that he'd met someone. She was from a wealthy family in Connecticut. Her father was a surgeon. Her mother sat on the boards of several charities and had a way of speaking that made everything she said sound like a final decision. I met her at a restaurant my son chose expensive. Downtown. The kind of place with menus that don't list prices. I wore my good blouse. I had my hair done. I ordered the least expensive thing and spent the whole dinner trying to make his girlfriend laugh, trying to show her I was easy, that I was fun, that I wasn't going to be a problem. I drove home that night thinking it had gone fine. I told myself it had gone fine. My son called me the next morning and said she thought I was lovely. I held the phone against my chest after we hung up and let myself feel relieved. That relief, I would learn, was a door I should have examined more carefully before I walked through it. They got engaged 18 months later. My son called to tell me on a Thursday evening, and I cried good tears, happy tears, and asked him everything. The ring, the proposal, where they'd been, whether she'd been surprised. He answered every question with a kind of patience that, in hindsight, felt like someone waiting for a bus, polite but elsewhere. I told him I wanted to help with the wedding. I told him I'd been setting money aside. I had $20,000, money I'd saved from overtime shifts and years of not spending on myself, and I wanted to contribute. He said that was generous. He said he'd talk to her. 2 weeks passed before he called back. The wedding, he explained, was going to be held at her family's estate in Connecticut. Her parents were covering most of it. There were going to be 250 guests. A planner had already been hired. He said he didn't think my contribution would be necessary. I told him I understood, even though something in my stomach had gone quiet the way things go quiet before a storm. Over the next year, I watched the wedding take shape from a distance. I heard about it in fragments, the caterer, the flowers, the dress that cost more than my first car. I was not asked to go to the dress fitting. I told myself future daughter-in-law probably wanted that to be just her mother and her friends. I told myself I was reading into things. I told myself a lot of things. My son called me in October, 7 months before the wedding. He said he needed to talk to me about something. His voice had a careful quality, the voice of someone who had rehearsed. He said the seating was complicated. He said the venue had a very specific aesthetic. He said his fiance's family had strong feelings about the photographs. He talked for 4 minutes around the edges of what he was trying to say, and then he said it. He said he thought it might be better if I didn't come to the wedding. I didn't say anything for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. He said he knew this was hard to hear. He said it wasn't about me. He said the two sides of the family were very different, and his fiancée was stressed, and it would just be easier. He actually used the word easier if the day wasn't complicated. I asked him what he meant by complicated. He paused. He said I might feel out of place. He said I didn't know anyone there. He said he didn't want me to be uncomfortable. I knew, as I sat there holding the phone, that none of those things were what he actually meant. What he meant was what he could not bring himself to say to me directly, though he had apparently said it to himself enough times to arrive at this phone call. He meant that I did not fit. He meant my peeling fence, and my good blouse, and my coupons, and my 31 years of nursing. He meant that I would be standing next to people like her parents, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, to be ashamed of me. I said I would think about it. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and went through 20 years of my life, the way you might go through a drawer you've avoided for a long time, slowly, carefully, finding things you'd forgotten about, the nights I'd worked double shifts, the graduation present I'd given him, the times I'd driven 6 hours to his apartment when he was sick or sad or just wanted company, the way he'd called me Mom his whole life, and how that word now felt like something I'd been borrowing. I called my friend she'd lived next door to me for 15 years, a retired teacher, the kind of woman who says what she means with absolute gentleness and absolutely no mercy, and I told her the whole thing. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill I have always admired in her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Go anyway." I told her I couldn't do that. I told her it would create a scene. I told her I didn't want to embarrass him. She said, "Honey, he's already decided you're an embarrassment. The question is what you decide." I thought about that for a very long time. I did not respond to my son right away. I let the weeks pass. I watched the wedding invitations go out, I knew because mutual family members mentioned receiving theirs, carefully not mentioning that I hadn't. I watched the RSVPs come in. I watched my son post things on social media that I looked at late at night, alone, in the blue light of my phone. In March, 4 months before the wedding, my son called again. His voice was lighter this time, relieved, as if he'd decided I'd agreed to his request simply because I hadn't objected to it. He said he was sorry things had worked out this way. He said he hoped I understood. He said he'd come visit me after the honeymoon. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd talk to him soon. Then I hung up, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I let myself feel everything I had been not feeling for months. It came up the way grief does not dramatically, not all at once, but in waves, in the specific memory of his face at his high school graduation, when he'd looked for me in the crowd and found me and smiled. In the memory of teaching him to drive in the empty church parking lot on Sunday mornings. In the memory of sitting beside him in the hospital, the year he had his appendix out and he'd been 22 and frightened and had held my hand like he was 8. I cried for a long time that night. I want to be honest about that. I didn't handle this with perfect dignity every moment. I was a mother who was going to miss her son's wedding, and that is a grief that doesn't have elegant words for it. I cried until I didn't have anything left, and then I got up and washed my face and made myself a cup of tea. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. I know because I had marked it on my calendar 11 months earlier, the day my son told me the date, before either of us knew how things would unfold. On that Saturday morning, I got up at 6. I showered. I put on the blue dress I'd bought the previous winter, not for the wedding. I'd bought it before any of this, at a department store sale, because I'd liked the color. I did my hair. I put on the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. My friend came by at 8 with coffee and a look on her face that asked me if I was sure without using any words. I told her I was sure. We drove 3 hours to Connecticut. I had not told my son I was coming. I had no plan beyond arriving. I had looked up the venue online, an estate with a white tent in the garden, photographs on the website, a fountain in the entrance, and I knew there would be 250 people there, which meant I could be invisible if I chose to be. I was 63 years old, and I'd spent a career making myself easy and unobtrusive in spaces where people were suffering and frightened. I knew how to be quiet. I knew how to take up very little room. We parked down the road and walked. My friend wore her good navy dress and walked beside me without talking, which was exactly right. The estate was exactly as I'd imagined it. Long driveway, white tent glowing in the June light, women in silk standing near the fountain with champagne. I could hear music. I could smell flowers. I walked around the perimeter and found a row of chairs set up at the very back of the outdoor seating. A half-dozen extra chairs placed behind the last row for overflow. I sat down in one of them. My friend sat beside me. Neither of us spoke. I could see him from where I sat. My son, in a dark suit, standing at the end of the aisle with his back to me, speaking quietly to one of the groomsmen. He looked so much like his father from behind, same slope of the shoulders, same way of standing with his weight on his left foot. Something moved in my chest that I don't have a word for. When the music changed and everyone stood, I stood too. I watched his fiancée walk down the aisle in her dress. She was beautiful. I want to be clear about that, she was genuinely beautiful. And my son's face when he saw her was the face of a man who was completely in love, and I did not let myself look away from that because it was real and it was his, and whatever else was true, it was real. I watched them say their vows. I could not hear the words from where I sat, but I watched my son's face, and I saw the moment he made a promise, and I let myself be there for it. Even from the back, even uninvited, even as whatever complicated, diminished version of his mother he had decided I was. Afterward, when the guests moved toward the tent, I did not go in. I stood near the fountain for a while. My friend handed me a handkerchief I hadn't known I needed, and then he saw me. He was crossing the lawn with his new wife, and he turned, I don't know why, some instinct, and his eyes found me the way eyes do when they're not expecting what they find. His wife said something to him. He said something back to her that I couldn't hear. He looked at me for a long moment across the lawn. I did not move toward him. I did not wave or make a scene or cry. I just looked at him, my son, who I had driven 6 hours in a single day to see get married, who I had worked 31 years to give a better start than I had, who had called me and used the word easier. I looked at him, and I let him see me see him. Then I turned in, and my friend and I walked back down the driveway to the car. We drove to a small restaurant in the town nearby and ate dinner. My friend had the salmon. I had the chicken. We shared a piece of apple pie. We talked about her granddaughter's soccer season and a book she'd been reading and the drive back, and none of it was the conversation I might have expected to be having on the evening of my son's wedding. It was a very ordinary dinner. It was also one of the most peaceful evenings I had in a long while. My son did not call that night. He did not call the next day. He called on Tuesday. I let it ring. I sat and watched the phone ring and let it go to voicemail. I had never done that with him before in my life. His message said he needed to talk to me. His voice was careful again, the rehearsed voice. But there was something else in it now, something that might have been the beginning of a reckoning, or might only have been discomfort. I had learned to be careful about telling the difference. I called him back the next morning. He asked me why I had come. He asked it quietly, not angrily, which surprised me. I told him I came because I wanted to see my son get married. I told him I sat in the back. I told him I hadn't spoken to anyone or made anything difficult. I told him the day had been his, exactly as he'd wanted it, and I had simply been there in the way that I had always been there at a distance, making it easy, taking up very little room. He was quiet for a long time. I told him something else then. I told him I had been thinking, over the past several months, about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I told him I was 63 and healthy, and I had money I had saved over 31 years, and I had spent so much of my life arranging myself around what other people needed from me that I had not, in a long time, asked myself what I needed. He asked what I meant. I told him I was going to sell the house I had lived in for 22 years, the house he had grown up in. The house with the rose bushes and the unpainted fence and the kitchen table where I had sat up waiting for him, more nights than he would ever know. He asked where I was going. I told him I wasn't sure yet. I had a list. Portugal was on the list. A small town in New Mexico a friend had mentioned. A cottage near the coast that I'd looked at online and thought about more than was probably sensible. I told him I had given a great deal of myself to a great many people, and I was not angry about that. I wanted him to hear that. I was not calling to be angry. But I was finished organizing my life around the hope of being included. He said, "Mom," I told him I loved him. I told him I would always love him, in the complete and particular way a mother loves a child, which is not conditional and not negotiable and not something he could either earn or lose. I told him that was not changing. But I told him that what was changing was the part of me that had waited, that had adjusted, that had made herself smaller and easier, and less so that he would not have to feel embarrassed by the person who had raised him. I told him that woman, the one who would agree not to come to her son's wedding and then sit quietly in a back row she had found on her own, that woman was done waiting to be invited in. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. I told him I heard that. I told him I genuinely heard it, and that it meant something to me. I told him I hoped he meant it, and I hoped he would have some time, in the years ahead, to think about what it meant to be the person who had been loved without condition by someone, and to have treated that carelessly, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I thought understanding that would make him a better man, a better husband. He said he didn't know what to say. I told him he didn't have to say anything right now. I told him I wasn't going anywhere, not in the permanent sense. I would be his mother until the day I died. He could call me. I would answer, but I was also going to live my life now, and I needed him to understand that those two things were both true at the same time. We said goodbye. I hung up the phone and looked at the kitchen, the yellow walls I'd painted 15 years ago, the windowsill with the small ceramic rooster my husband's mother had given us as a wedding gift, the calendar on the wall, where I had once written my son's wedding date in blue pen. I took the calendar down. I called the realtor that afternoon. The house sold in 3 weeks, to a young family with twin girls who ran through the rooms laughing and made me feel, watching them from the driveway, that the house was doing what houses are meant to do. I took the ceramic rooster and the rose clippings I'd carefully dug up from the garden and the box of photographs from the hall closet. I left the fence. My friend drove with me to the coast for a week while I figured out next steps. We walked on the beach in the mornings and sat on the porch in the evenings, and I read 4 books in a row, which I had not done since before my husband died. I ate whatever I wanted for dinner. I stayed up late. I woke up without an alarm. I thought about my son every day. I want to be honest about that too. I did not stop thinking about him. I did not stop loving him or hoping that the sorry he had said on the phone was the beginning of something true. But I had stopped organizing my hope around him. That was the difference. My love for him had always been a given. It was the waiting that I'd ended. He called me 3 weeks later, not the careful, rehearsed voice, this time a different voice, quieter. A voice that reminded me, in a way I hadn't expected, of the voice he'd had at 17, sitting across from me at the dinner table after his father died, trying to figure out whether I was going to fall apart. He asked how I was. He asked where I was. I told him I was on the coast. He said it sounded nice. I told him it was. He asked if I was happy. I told him I was getting there. There was a long pause, the comfortable kind. And then he said he'd been thinking. He said he'd been thinking about a lot of things. He said he wanted to visit me, not to fix things or explain himself or have any particular conversation. He was clear about that. He said he just wanted to see me. I told him I'd like that. He came the following month. We walked on the beach the same way I'd been walking with my friend. In the mornings, not saying much. He looked at the ocean. I looked at him. He was 30 years old and newly married, and I could see him standing there in the wind, working through something the same way he'd always worked through things, slowly, in his body, not out loud. On the last morning, before he drove back, he sat down at the kitchen table and put his coffee down and looked at me with his father's eyes. He said he was sorry, not the careful sorry from the phone call, the other kind, the kind that costs something. He said he had let someone else's idea of who he should be become more important than who he actually was and who he actually came from, and he was sorry. I put my hand on his hand. I told him that was enough. I told him that was exactly enough. I did not take back everything I'd said about living my life now. But I also did not close the door, because I am his mother, and that is not something I know how to be halfway. We are figuring it out. Slowly, in the particular and unglamorous way that real relationships get repaired, not in a single conversation, not in a grand gesture, but in phone calls and visits and the willingness to be honest with each other about hard things. It is not perfect. I don't expect it to be perfect. I am living on the coast now, in a small house I'm renting, while I decide what comes next. I have a porch. I have a good lamp for reading. I have my mother's pearl earrings and my husband's mother's ceramic rooster on the windowsill. I walk on the beach in the mornings and watch the light change on the water, and I think about what it means to have spent 63 years learning how to love people and to finally, in the last third of my life, to be learning how to love myself with something like the same consistency. I think about the rose bushes sometimes. I hope the family with the twin girls is taking care of them. I hope the girls know, someday, what it means to tend something for a long time, to come back to it season after season and ask nothing in return, except that it keep growing. I think that's the closest thing I have to a lesson from all of this. Not that you should give up on the people you love when they disappoint you, not that you should harden yourself or stop being the person who shows up, but that showing up, the real kind, the honest kind, has to include showing up for yourself, that the love you pour out into the world is not separate from the love you owe yourself, that you cannot keep giving from an empty place and call it virtue. I am 63 years old. I have a porch and a good lamp and the ocean outside my window every morning. I am, finally, not waiting to be invited in.